大家好，欢迎来到 Raise a Glass，是一台讨论对我们很有影响的故事跟讲故事的人的播客节目。今天我们会讨论余华的《活着》。我叫丁浩。
And I'm Eric Lintela.
那讨论今天的话题以前，我得问 Eric。What's in your glass?
I had opened this earlier. I, in fact, have an Oktoberfest. It is the same as I've drank in the past, which actually means it probably came from the same 12-pack from many a moon ago. How about you, Hunter?
Nice. Well, I have some Lai Tang Yuan, which are rice balls that are traditionally eaten as glutinous rice balls with a kind of sesame sweet coconut filling.
Are they desserts?
They're traditionally eaten around like New Year's, their New Year's festival, as kind of like a sweet snack. There's kind of a cool story behind the recipe. I have this recipe book. This old guy named Mr. Lai. He started selling these on the street and then eventually opened a restaurant and became very famous. And now they're eaten throughout China. But yeah. So I'm going to eat one of these. And in my glass, I have 热水, which is just hot water. Because in China, generally, they don't really drink cold water. They drink it warm or as tea. But this is going to fill my mouth up for like 2 minutes. So you can introduce the story for our English-speaking listeners.
Yes. Hunter, I'm getting a weird sense of déjà vu. It's our second time recording this. We forgot to hit record the first time.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I only made it about like 30 minutes in.
Yeah, just half an hour.
But today we're bringing a novel called To Live before us by Yu Hua. And Hunter will correct my pronunciation later. But this is the story of a storyteller who is traveling throughout rural China and gathering the stories of everyday people. And he bumps into an old man tilling his field with his ox named Fu Gui. And he talks with Fu Gui for hours and hours and hours. And this is Fu Gui's story from the beginning of his life up till then, close to the end. And we will share more of what happens in this story as time goes on, because this is not just a one-part episode. This is, in fact, going to be a two-part episode. And in our second part, when it comes out, we are going to be discussing not only the second part of this book, this novel, but we will also be discussing the film that came out just around the same time that this novel came out.
A few years
and
after.
we'll tell you that story when we get to the film. But that's the story we're going to be talking about today. If you didn't catch it at the beginning, Hunter opened us up with Mandarin. Welcome to our podcast. And with that, as is usual, Hunter, what are you raising a glass or pouring one out for this week?
This might be a storyception within a storyception because I just said something like this. And now I'm saying it again. And I am raising a glass to stories within this podcast about stories and the storytellers that shape us. Because I have found that a great way to wrangle a toddler is to tell stories and be creative. And it can really transform what might have been a pour one out moment into a raise a glass moment. I was brought him to the playground earlier today, and he didn't really want to leave, but we had to go because I was really hungry, and it was lunchtime, and he had to have his nap soon. And what could have been a power struggle, as often happens around 2 and 3 years of age, I started pretending that he was floating away and that I had to grab him. So I picked him up and was like, "You're floating, you're floating. I have to get you to the baby magnet in the car." So then we floated all the way to the car where I strapped him into the baby magnet. I said, "Whew, God, you're safe. Glad you didn't float away." And it was really, he loved it. It was a lot of fun. So stories. And I'm pouring one out for forgetting to hit the record button. Yeah.
I don't see how people could like redo the same type of conversation multiple times. Like, we clearly can't.
Yeah. Yeah. What about you?
Hunter, I am going to pour one out just for the challenges of life. Obviously, we just had a small snafu, and there are much larger things happening, both in our lives, lives of those we love, our world. I'm just thinking about those in Syria and Turkey right now, responding to another huge earthquake. Thankfully, less intense than the previous one, but it just feels like a dark time.
Yeah.
And sometimes it just gets me down, even though I know we have hope in the midst of it. But I am raising a glass to seeds. I got about 3 dozen packs of seeds, so I'm going to start everything from tomatoes and peppers to eggplant, huckleberry. Many stories about this to come. I'm sure many a raise a glass moment. Hopefully not too many pour one out ones in the coming episodes. And Hunter, I know there's something that you want to share, and it's your news to share before we dive into our story.
Yeah, my wife and I are expecting a baby before the end of this month. So, so the podcast is going to go on a little hiatus after this episode, I think, and I'm going to enjoy the new little miracle with my family.
Are you going to go on PFL, Podcast Free Life? That was a little parenting state, money, tax, whatever. When we come back, we are going to have a few more stories for you. And if you have thoughts of stories you want us to share, or stories you would love to share, or ways that you would love to kind of give your thoughts to this podcast, feel free to reach out to us. Let us know. I want to give a small shout out right now to Kyle. If you're listening to this episode, I know I told you earlier today that you would have no ideas what this particular story was about. So I have no idea if you're actually listening to it, but I appreciate you. And maybe we'll see you on the show sometime. I loved your idea you threw out earlier today. So sticking up here.
All right.
So Hunter, let's start off at the beginning. Not at the story, that is, but of why you are bringing this story to live before us today. What's up?
So the first time I encountered To Live, I was studying abroad in China. I majored in Chinese language and literature. And during our immersion program, our teachers, we might have had a break or something, but they wanted like a more relaxed assignment or something, which is rare because that was not a relaxed program. Learned a lot of Chinese, but pretty
Drinking through a fire
stressful.
hose.
Yeah, pretty much. But I loved my time over there, and they showed us this movie, and I never forgot it. I didn't watch it again until like 1 or 2 years ago, and it was everything I remembered it was. And then I read the book a couple summers ago, I think, and the book is different. I think that it has a more focused theme than the movie does, but they generally show the same theme, which is the value of life. Fu Gui goes through so much in his life. He lives through uh, the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party war for control of China. He's conscripted into the army, survives, comes back home, lives through the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, and then even after that. And, he has so much taken away. And this is actually a quote from Yu Hua. He says that, even though Fu Gui, throughout different points in the story, he has very little reason to live, from deaths that happen around him and just what happens to him. But he has more respect for life than any of Yu Hua's other characters. And this book, it really, to me, to give kind of a broad overview and what it means to me is it shows the value of, it shows you what's really important in your life, which is the value of your own life and the value of the ones you love, and what's really worth striving for and
holding on to.
Yeah, and also in a broader context, this book I think is also I always wanted to bring it on the podcast, but I never thought it would really be topical. But with COVID and the rise of hate crimes and stereotypes that a lot of Americans have about Asian people and Chinese people, and the stuff with the weather balloons, spy balloons,
some weird stuff happening right now.
Yeah, this book and movie, this story really illustrates that no matter what governments are doing in countries, if you go to the country and you talk to the people, no matter where you go, that people are, most of them are like you and me, and they're just trying to live.
Well, to make the most of their life, and in addition to that, and their relationships. It was that little bit kind of sticks with me, Hunter, because my work, a large part about it is challenging Americans to view refugees and other immigrants as fellow humans, and even more specifically towards Christians, to challenge the viewpoint of what does it look like to love our neighbors and to lift up the dignity that's inherent in all people because we're made in the image of God. And I know the story doesn't get into that, but that to me is a huge piece of what I do and kind of who I am. And I didn't connect that to this book at all while I was going through it, but I did to what you just shared. So
Yeah. I mean, that's what it means to me. There's multiple points in the book where, Fu Gui says, I've got to keep living. When he's conscripted by the army and the nationalist army, and there's more bullets than rice, and no one cares about the bullets because there's so many bullets, and that they have to sleep on them and stuff, and they just want rice. And when he
eventually nobody
survives,
cares about the rice.
yeah, right.
Because there's nothing to burn to heat up the water to cook the
Yeah,
rice.
yeah. And after he survives that, he just says, "I've got to keep living. I've got to get back to my family."
He definitely is a character that is worth following for this story.
Yeah,
Even if he's not a likable character for most or all or any, or sure, different people have different views on that. He's a character that's worth following, and has wisdom to share.
yeah. I liked Fu Gui on the second read more. I think just because on the first read, even though I knew kind of what was going to happen, they still changed things from the movie. They reduced the number of deaths in the movie. So it's kind of a little bit, it's kind of a different experience, even they have very similar themes. I was so invested in what happens to his family, I think, that I didn't really focus on Fu Gui as a character as much as, the things that he could have done better, maybe. But on the second read, kind of knowing what was coming, it gave me a little more space to think about Fu Gui himself. And Yu Hua mentions the storyteller when he meets Fu Gui. He sees him as just another one of the old men who are around China who start crying for no reason, and then you ask them, and they can't really tell you why they were crying. And he thought Fu Gui was kind of no different from them, of these other men that he had met. But he realized later on, he says that Fu Gui was special because Fu Gui was interested in his life and his life experiences and what they meant. And not many of the people that the narrator, the wandering story collector, met were.
And he brings up at one point that's a luxury to be able to think about your life, that is often only afforded to people in without financial poverty,
right.
To be able to take the time to have enough mental energy to reflect. I think he brings up at one point.
Yeah.
Well, Hunter, I'm realizing that there's so much of this story that we want to share about that if we start talking through the story, we are going to just keep talking. And I think that instead of doing that, I would like to spend more of this episode in the few minutes we have left talking about more overall impressions and kind of larger themes and thoughts we have on this story, and what it makes us think about, because I think the story itself necessitates time to walk through it. And so almost in many ways, this kind of episode is the why it shaped us or how it shaped you. And the next episode will be the prove it.
Yeah.
Proving ground,
Okay.
walking through those pieces of it. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's all right. I think that's good. I've been trying to read this in Chinese. So that's one way it's shaped me.
Yeah. Well, and the first time you listened to it was in Chinese, right?
Yeah, the first time I saw the movie, it was I didn't have English subtitles. They showed character and opinion subtitles, but uh, no English. So I understood maybe 50 to 60% of what
Mm-hmm.
was said. The accents are kind of hard. It's one thing I want to share about Chinese language. This is kind of tangentially related, but I think is really cool. Is that most of the people in China, their first language is not Mandarin.
Okay.
There are hundreds of dialects spoken in China throughout the different provinces. Sometimes even within provinces, there are multiple dialects. And we say the term dialect, and we think like, oh, kind of like a different accent. But in this context, the like a Chinese dialect is really like another language entirely.
Mm.
Like two people who speak a different dialect in China cannot understand each other if they just speak their dialects. Um, they speak Mandarin, and they all learn Mandarin in order to talk to each other because that's the official language of the Chinese
Mm.
country. But there's hundreds of dialects in China. Um, it,
Is sorry. Is Mandarin also then like, for lack of better words, like a simplified version of these dialects, or is it a completely different? Is it like German versus French type, or is that just not
um,
even an appropriate type of comparison to my
I
Western mind?
mean, more or less. I mean, I guess you could make that comparison. I would say more like Spanish and French.
Okay,
Um,
so they're related,
yeah, I mean, like
but that doesn't mean you
this
can
is my
understand each other.
armchair language theorist knowledge. But like essentially, if you have a people group that all speak the same language and they spread out over a large area, eventually people farther apart will start speaking other languages because languages
Mm-hmm.
transform through
Yeah,
what's called semantic drift. Um, and I'm getting this from the story of the human language, great courses. If you want to know the
great
source,
courses.
yeah, where an actual linguist kind of goes through stuff. It's absolutely fascinating.
Not a
Really cool.
philologist though, so sadly Ransom wasn't there.
Yeah, well, there's
Throwback to Out of the Silent Planet. Paralander. Win. I don't know where that came from. I'm sorry. Please continue.
it's okay. I wasn't really gonna go
Languages
much
change.
farther.
That's
Yeah,
it.
languages change. But reading it in to get back to the novel as a writer, it's been really uh, fascinating to like try and read something written. Read Chinese prose because when I was
Mm,
studying Chinese, I read a lot of like more academically geared Chinese content, like
mhm.
news articles or
Okay. Yeah.
information about like divorce rate or Chinese culture or like Starbucks, Xingba Ke. Um, that's Starbucks in Chinese. But when I started reading this, I was wondering like, am I ever gonna be able to read like good Chinese prose? Because
Mm,
like for someone studying English, like okay, maybe you can read some news stories and stuff, but like reading Hemingway is a totally different experience in English. And when I started reading this, I was like, okay, I think I found it.
hmm.
um, and it's just really beautiful because the Chinese language is a um, the written language is characters, and you don't spell anything. They're all just characters. So each word, like the word sun, you don't write sun. There's no components or anything. You just write the
Mhm.
character, kind of like drawing a little picture for sun, just r, and um, which means that like and characters are kind of made up, more complex characters are made up of like radicals. So like the character for sun can be in a bunch of other different characters that are more complex. So one of like the really fascinating things about reading this in Chinese is like I have to look things up. I have a little dictionary
Mm-hmm.
on my Kindle that I can look things up. But um, imagine if you have a sentence like he came to a cool running river. In Chinese, imagine if the word for river, when you looked at the word river, you
Mm-hmm.
felt like you were looking at a uh, a almost a visual representation of a river. It's like if you
Okay.
actually looked at the word, you can kind of get impressions from the radicals as you're reading it, and it's so cool. It's like I think some people might think that if you're trying to be a writer of the English language, it might hurt you to study other languages or something like that,
Hmm.
or like it's not really worth it. And I think that's total bogus, um, because like studying another language can help you realize what English is good at and what it's not good at.
Interesting.
Chinese can be so efficient and communicate so much like imagery and impressions um, in such a short, just like, 5 or 6 little characters. They're much shorter than words. Um, and they're very quick. They're all like one syllable. Um, and English is just really not an efficient language. Um, it's pretty hodgepodge. And to be like, I love English, of course. It's my native tongue, and it's beautiful. It's like beautiful and ugly at the same time. Um, and it's noble and uh, vile, all at once. But
Hunter, actually, that raises a question. It wasn't going to be the top question I asked, but this is a pretty vile book. And it's very blunt. Fu Gui's character in English is very blunt. He swears a ton. I was
hmm.
not prepared for that. And so
Oh,
part of the reason it took me a long time is because I couldn't listen to it with my son in the room. And so at about quadrupled or quintupled the length of time it took me to get through it.
because you were listening to it. Yeah, I didn't realize
and
that.
It's a very aggressive. In Mandarin, is this a good translation from what you've read?
It's a good
Because
translation. Um, there is beauty in the translation language, but it's very sparse, and like Yu Hua is very very blunt, even for Chinese. But I guess Virginia Woolf once said about reading Russian writers in English is that we have read them without their clothes on, uh,
hmm,
because we have stripped them of their native language. We have stripped them of style, of subtle inflections, of
mm-hmm.
lots of things that we don't get when we're reading it in a translation. And I think that's true for this. Maybe for me, because I've studied Chinese, I can see the language behind it a little bit when I'm reading it in English, and more because I've started trying to read it in Chinese. Um, so maybe it comes across even more blunt, um, if you haven't really studied Chinese. Um, but Yu Hua, I think even among uh, Chinese people in China, he has a reputation as being more blunt. And I think one reviewer said about him, because Yu Hua used to be a dentist. Um, one guy said that Yu Hua is so cruel to his characters. One can only imagine the tortures that his patients undergone in his dentist chair.
Oh my God. So is the storyteller in this story Yu Hua? Is that the idea? Are we to understand that the guy traveling around is Yu Hua himself?
I'm sure there's a lot of Yu Hua in him, but I don't think it's meant to be actually Yu Hua. Yeah.
So it kind of leads me to a different point, Hunter. We've talked about this book for a while, and wanting to do it with the movie, which we will at some point in our next episode. I listened to this book because that's the way in which I had time to work through it, and I honestly have not. I've not. My knowledge of Chinese literature is sparse, as to say it's practically nothing, but it is not nothing. I've read some different religious pieces. I've read quite a few Buddhist texts, and anyways, this book made me angry. Multiple points. It made me want to stop reading it at many times. It frustrated me. It led me down to expect one thing and then kind of gave me another thing. It was also very clearly well written, which is not by any means contradictory nor mutually exclusive to any of those things I shared. And at the end of it, I understood how Fu Gui, to live, kind of like works as a title for him and is holding on to life. But I don't think I got that for much of the story, which might have been my own, misunderstanding of it. I'm sure, clearly, many parts were, and I'm excited to watch the film because I think that'll give another kind of lens through which I can see this. But yeah, I didn't particularly enjoy this one, and I know it'll be one of those books like many of the ones we read. It seems to be the higher the quality of a book, the more it can handle scrutiny and conversation, the more I like it by the end of our conversation. But I almost felt like this book needed like trigger warnings on it, like, hey, don't get attached. Hey, everything's crappy. And my copy says a work of astounding emotional power by a different author. Wrote that on the top, and like it is astounding emotional power. And it's also introducing me to a culture I don't really know. And I appreciated the blunt honesty of Fu Gui. But that didn't mean I was happy when I read it.
I mean, I think, like, yeah, it's Yu Hua is incredibly brutal. But when we meet Fu Gui, he's alone. So it essentially it kind of gives the story away when Fu Gui is narrating his life, but it never really says it explicitly. And I don't know. I think I want to apologize that I didn't give you enough of a warning. I guess because I have had this story in my head so long and have formed my own opinions and interpretations. I didn't really think about what it would be like to read this for the first time and get hit with it for the first time, especially in the book, because the book is more brutal than the movie. Having read the book a couple times, when you have more space and when you know it's going to happen and you're not as like reading it it's really hard for me, at least. The first time it was really hard to put down because
Mm.
you want to know what happens, and but once you are like kind of less invested in just finding out what happens, which I think is probably a cultural thing. I feel like a lot of our popular stories and things are just about finding out what happens,
Hmm.
a good plot, which,
Yeah.
has its merits as a storytelling method, but there are many other ways to tell stories and ways that stories,
To the lighthouse.
yeah, and as far as like the point of telling a story and all of that. And once you kind of step back from that and view it more as a whole, as I tried to the second time around, I found a lot of beauty in his descriptions of the countryside, um, in the interactions between Fu Gui and his family. Distinctly, I have in my head right now the image at the end of when the storyteller is talking to Fu Gui and Fu Gui tells him what happens to his last family member. Yu Hua mentions a peasant going by with a bamboo pole, and the bamboo pole is squeaking. Just a peasant uh, walking past with the pole squeaking. And Fu Gui himself is very peaceful. The countryside is very peaceful. There's a lot of beautiful imagery from the countryside. Um, so Yu Hua has said that a lot of this was based on some of his experiences growing up during the Cultural Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
I think he maybe made them a little more extreme, but uh, he has noticed a lot of details about um, the people who were living in this time, and he has a lot of love for them and for um, China itself.
Mm-hmm. And this was not an easy time to live.
No.
And that was also part of my just lack of knowledge of history. Actually, I have a potentially weird question for you. One of the things I've been thinking about in understanding that Fu Gui's story kind of represents like the life of a person in the midst of the narrative of a story, like of a history, really his story in history, and the way he interacts with it. It made me wonder the ways in which this story could be like Forrest Gump. In that Forrest Gump is a story, obviously a very different type of emotional story, different, in many ways, very different story, but it's a story of a person interacting like without, without their own knowledge or purposefulness in the history and the way that these huge events impacted one life. And obviously that's much more an Americanized cinematic piece. But this story purposefully captures an incredibly changing, the time of incredible change in China. And it, I, I think this, even just the idea of a chicken turning into a goose, turning into a goat,
Yeah.
turning into an ox.
Yeah.
I missed one step, but and then becoming a goose, and then becoming a chicken, then the chicken disappearing. Which is a story kind of that is kind of repeated throughout this. I don't know. It was just making me think about a little bit about that same type of narrative that Forrest Gump was going for. What do you think about that? You kind of gave me a little scoff and when I brought it up.
Yeah, I mean, Forrest Gump is more of a comedy. I think it's a
and I'm not talking
comedy
about
drama.
yes,
Yeah.
totally.
And I mean, the movie has a lot of comic moments in it, actually.
Well, that's encouraging. The
Yeah.
book is not. This is not a funny book.
No, it's really not. Some of the things Fu Gui says are kind of funny. Like he has all these little sayings that he um, says. Most of them are kind of dirty jokes. Um,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean they're not funny though.
Totally.
Um, here's one, I guess, from the end. In my younger days, I wandered amok. At middle age, I wanted to stash everything in a trunk. And now that I'm old, I've become a monk.
Great. That is funny and
Yeah.
poetic. Yeah.
And I see what you're going for. And I guess, yeah, that comparison is valid. I just feel like when I think about Forrest Gump, I think about absurdity and which is a device, very,
Totally.
very
And
valid device. And
I agree. And I'm not thinking the tone, and I'm not
yeah,
thinking the type of story or even the mode in which the story is told, but
mhm.
the decision of who to focus on and what time period to focus on. Like I don't know. I'm trying to think of a good example of something that I've read or seen in my own life for those who haven't watched it or read this, which I'm guessing is most of our listeners,
Yeah.
like to help kind of give an idea of what it is. Because it's not like Saving Private Ryan, right? It's Saving
No.
Private Ryan if it was, preceded by the Great Depression and,
Yeah.
and following it, was all of a sudden, living in,
Yeah. I haven't
it's
read
so
it,
much of history.
but maybe like Gone with the Wind or Roots,
Okay.
uh, or something like that. That's it's kind of like a family saga. And the book is very much Fu Gui's story primarily, but it tells his family, and the movie gives more time for Jiajian, his Fu Gui's wife, to be more of a main character with
Mm.
Fu Gui. Um, and the actor who plays her is actually absolutely amazing. She's been in a lot of other stuff. Um, and the guy who plays Fu Gui is really good too. He was actually a comedy actor, not a drama actor. So, but he really does a fantastic job um, as Fu Gui. I guess the thing with I think that is definitely they have similarities. I guess the difference in my mind is that when I think about Forrest Gump, I'm not really sure if it's trying to say anything. Like,
Mm.
I'm not really sure if the movie even knows what it's going for. Um, doesn't mean like there's not a lot
Hmm.
there. Of course there
Yeah.
is. It's Forrest Gump. But I feel like To Live has a much more um, clear theme,
Yeah.
and Yu Hua has more of a hold on what he wants to represent with Fu Gui's story.
That makes sense. Fu Gui is a character that when you meet him, he has a like driving reason for his life
Yeah.
and the driving theme in his life, and everything that he tells ends up coming back to that theme, even though you don't really realize it.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least I didn't realize it until I got most of the way through the
Yeah.
story.
Yeah. I feel like we're probably reaching the end of our time.
Yes.
If we want to make this a shorter episode, I have one thing I think we can end on.
Great.
Uh,
I'd love to.
it's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and also a lot while I was reading this for the second time, um, which is about how hard life can be. And
Hmm.
I think that in America, in the middle class and up, we can sort of convince ourselves that life is going to be fun and games the whole time, and we could amuse ourselves with endless games and movies and whatever. And, but then again, I think if you go and ask people, have you had an easy life? They're probably going to say no. And, reading this book, like really, Fu Gui starts out with a pretty easy life. He's in the gambling house, the House of Qing.
He can do whatever he wants.
Gambling away and whatever. And then the rest of his life is, in Chinese, you'd say hanyo tongku, which is like bitter. It's very bitter and hard and full of poverty and death. And we have hard lives, but in this book, it is really taken to an extreme, and you can see the hardships that he's gone through, and it really makes you question. At least for me, it made me realize, more clearly what I really valued in life and what I wanted and what was the most important thing to me. Because I think over the years, as I've grappled with, after graduating the college named after a father, without a father, got a lot farther. Grappling with the question of Ecclesiastes, which is, what does it all mean? And you find out more and more is vanity. More and more the things I thought I wanted, once I get them, they're just vanity. But in the end, life is its own end. And this book really distills that down to show, I believe it shows that living is its own end. It's its own miracle worth protecting, no matter how difficult or full of bitterness it is. Fu Gui is, Yu Hua says that Fu Gui, out of all of his characters, even though Fu Gui has probably the least reason for living, Fu Gui himself has the most respect for life, has the utmost respect for it. And to me, that's really the thrust of this book. And it does it in this period of Chinese history where life was just trampled on, by the government, by politics, by just hardship and famine, and yet the people endure, and we endure, and life endures. And that's a good thing.
That it is. Andrew, thank you for bringing this to us this week, and I look forward to connecting with you on our next episode, whenever that may be. And I'm very excited for the many things that will happen in between. So, signing off for a short season, and we will see you soon.
再见。